Right. I've got an awful lot of slides, so I'm going to have to go very fast. I'm going to tell you something about an area where I've been doing research for quite some time, and a project that I've recently started working on there with a group of archaeologists and environmental scientists, and I'll try and say something about the implications for the future of what we're finding out, although that's not the brief that we've got for the project. Now, the area concerned is the Kelabit Highlands, which is in the island of Borneo, and this is the position of it. It's part of a tableland intersected by low mountain ranges, which is the headwaters of many rivers, which is in Malaysia and Indonesia. And it's inhabited by the Kelabit and related peoples who are generally called the Apadwat peoples, after the mountain range going down the middle through the border. They say they've always been there, and then that their ancestors, interestingly, in reference to what someone earlier said, were giants called the Lun Rabada, who lived in the time of Getoman Lalud, when people joined with great power. And they say that everybody in the world came from this highland area, and they were washed down in a flood, all except those that are left now. This is the forest of the tableland area. Now, the tableland is known for a couple of things. First of all, for megaliths of various kinds. This is Tom Harrison, who's known for the Mass Observation Archive, which is at Sussex at the moment, as well as for having been parachuted into the Kelabit Highlands during the Second World War to organize resistance against the Japanese. And he spent time in the Highlands investigating the megaliths whilst he was curator of the Sarawak Museum. It's also famous for wet rice, which is unusual in the centre of Borneo. The wet rice that was practiced was in using various different methods in the past, actually, some of which were actually shifting cultivation, although I won't go into that at the moment. There was really a continuum between wild forest and the rice fields, actually, rather than there being a real distinction, although I'll go back to that in a minute in terms of people's minds. Swidden fields gradually became forest. People managed secondary forest in subsequent years, and they hunt more in secondary forest than in primary forest. Much of the forest is anthropogenic. There are sago groves, which may well be anthropogenic. There are lots of old settlements. There are fruit trees all over the place, but we don't yet know how much of it is actually stated to be anthropogenic, because it's something that needs to be surveyed. However, they rely heavily on the wild as well, on both protein and meat, and on lots and lots of vegetables and mushrooms and so on. Now, besides the Kelabit and related peoples, there are people who are usually described as hunter-gatherers, Penan, who used to live in the Kelabit Highlands too. They manage sago groves, as well as hunting and gathering in the forest, as do the Kelabit and other peoples related to them. I've been doing research in the Kelabit Highlands since the late 80s in a village called Padale, which is in the southern part of the Kelabit Highlands. I've been focusing on rice and latterly the forest. My first focus of research was rice, and I went on to look more at the forest when I realized how complementary the two were. They can be said to be a cosmological pair, both essential to the proper way to live. At the rice meal, which consists of wild foods, paradigmatically meat, especially from wild pigs, and rice, proper humanity is constructed. Kinship, human kinship, rice-based kinship, I call it, and status is constructed through bringing together wild life force from the forest and rice to create human life, which is called ulun. And the greater your ulun, the higher your status. Now, I said that there is actually a continuum between the wild and rice growing, but in Kelabit mines, and actually in the mines of the Penan too, arguably, there is a big divide. Rice is completely different from plants that grow on their own, as they say. the fact that the Kelabit grow rice is the basis of their feeling that they own the area in a way that they don't believe the Penan do. They change the vegetation and they change the landscape, and this generates a sense of ownership. And the strongest expression of this is through the rice field, which is an expanded space for humans. And I think it's actually, it can be seen as an expanded hearth, a hearth for cooking the rice meal, essentially. Making these spaces actually generates rights to hunting and gathering too. Not exclusive rights, but people usually hunt or gather in areas, especially hunting, in areas which their families previously farmed. And they're associated with apical ancestors. Now the Kelabit make marks, a tu, let me go on the landscape. These are of various sorts. Funerary marks, that's stone jars, tables like the one you saw earlier, Chinese dragon jars are placed in cemeteries, and they make marks at feasts of merit called irau. They erect megaliths. This is until the 50s they erected megaliths and made stone carvings, earthworks, and mounds called purupun. They also make still ditches and bunds for rice fields, which can be seen as marks on the landscape too. Okay, this is a stone carving of a man. The figure of a man or a woman, we don't really know, a human, is associated with aristocracy throughout Borneo with high status. Now, this is an irau feast held in 1987. Now, these two marks are made at irau feasts, were made at irau feasts, and they were only possible. They are still only possible through rice farming because you have to feed a lot of people a lot of rice, and in the past you had to make rice beer as well. They used to be held at secondary funerals. They're now held at naming ceremonies, which are quite major rites of transition for adults as well as children. And they project an imagined version of people's relationship with the forest and the landscape through the making of marks. And the association with rice, which itself involves making marks, especially nowadays because rice fields now involve making bunds and digging large areas. Now the Penan, the hunter-gatherers, the so-called hunter-gatherers, do not make these marks, and that's the basis of the Kelabit belief that they don't really have any rights to the land, and they were actually evicted from the Kelabit Highlands a couple of years ago by the Kelabit chief. So the Penan only make marks called oban, which could be translated perhaps as footprints, and this refers back to what someone said earlier too. They leave traces, but not visible traces, on the landscape. The Kelabit leave those too, but they make a tu, and that's the main important mark. And this is a stone burial jar in a cemetery, and that's also a kind of mark. This is a dragon jar. They used to be used for making rice beer in the past, and for disposing of important people in cemeteries. Now, to go on to the cultured rainforest, which is a nice term, as somebody said. It was not invented by me, I'm sorry to say. It was invented by one of my colleagues on the project that I'm working on at the moment, which started last year, funded by the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council. And this focuses on the community of Padale, my field site for the past 20 years, and the Kelapang Valley in which it's situated, which you can see here, which contains at the moment 3 communities. Which are in red. The other marks you can see there are sites which have been excavated so far by the archaeologists. Now, in the project we've got anthropology, archaeology, and environmental science. We also have GIS, and we've just brought in a bit of botany. And we've got a number of different universities involved, as you can see. Now, within anthropology, we are following up on data that I've gathered already looking at stories and myths about forest spirits, the achievements of ancestors and culture heroes, and linking those to places in the landscape. We're gathering genealogies and settlement histories. We're looking at histories of farming, and we're linking up to the archaeological work through getting informants' views of what we're doing. They help us to find sites, and they also comment on the finds that we have made. They'll also be commenting on what we say about the vegetation changes that we find to have taken place through pollen cores. And here we have Giles. So this is Giles Langub from the University of Malaysia, Sarawak, who's working with me in the anthropological part of the project, talking to some Penan. Now, archaeological sites include old settlement sites, megaliths, which are at cemeteries, and also era marks, because they are quite distinct kinds of megaliths, and also rock shelters, which are used at the moment for hunting, but seem to have been used in the past also for hunting, and you never know, perhaps for settlement, who knows. So this is one of the archaeological sites. This is one of the jars, stone jars used for disposing of bodies in the past. These stone jars are said by informants to have been made in the time of joining with great power in the past, because they say their immediate ancestors didn't know how to make such jars. They knew how to erect megaliths and make stone carvings, but they didn't know how to make these jars. But people were disposed of in and around these jars up until the 50s, creating a sort of a settlement of the dead, you know. And we're using earth cores to identify pollen phytoliths, soil deposition sequences, and these are being taken in peat bogs in old river meanders, and this year in a pond in an old settlement site we're going to work on a ridgetop. And here is Samantha Jones taking an earth core. This is the PhD student working on our project. So we're taking radiocarbon dating samples from archaeological contexts as well as from cores. And the aims are to build on anthropological data that we already have and to develop a time depth. I mean, this was my original desire, to try to look backwards both into the imagined past and the real past at the same time, which is fairly tricky, actually. My aim in bringing in archaeologists and environmental scientists to try to understand both the present and the past better, if we can, to work together to do that. And we're presenting all the data together on one GIS database and map. We're also going to be putting on museum exhibitions at the end of the project at the Sarawak Museum and the Cambridge Museum of Archaeology, and possibly the British Museum, which holds a collection of Kelabit artifacts which I made in the late 80s. So a few findings. Settlement patterns. So far, we've only excavated, we've excavated one old river valley site, one old ridgetop site, and taken some samples from present-day settlements and very recent settlements to try to relate them to each other. This year we're going to bring in, as I said, another ridgetop settlement which has a pond nearby. And the river valley site has yielded dates which are quite early, as you can see, 2300 to 2000 BC. And the ridgetop site is later, 1430 to 1640. But the river valley site is actually one which was inhabited about 50 years ago, exactly the same place. So that's quite an interesting finding. Now, from oral histories, we know that ridgetop settlements were the norm until the middle of the 19th century, when the peace which was brought about by the brooks enabled people to move down into the main river valley. And they have since then gathered together in larger settlements right down in the valley, leading to the establishment of Padali itself, which is an amalgam of a number of previous settlements. we know from stories about culture heroes that high status is associated with living on what's called patar, or flat land, flat fertile land, which may well have largely been in the valleys. So it's possible that there was a fluctuation between river valley and ridgetop settlements, depending on the strengths of leaders. So that's an early hypothesis. We don't know much about when or why, but we're going to try to link this more closely with genealogies, and obviously we'll get more dates and more information from excavations. Now, through genealogies and settlement histories, we're identifying some apical ancestors that are said to have been the origins of important lines to which people attach themselves. What happens in the Kelabit Highlands is that certain prominent individuals are named back the generations, and other people say that they are related to those people. So they form a central core line to which other people say they're related. And apical ancestors are identified at the tops of those. Often they're a pair of siblings. And there are, we've identified alliances between apical ancestors from different lines, actually. And this is associated with patterns of incoming peoples from other areas, it seems. We've made some links between important people and some of the significant marks in the landscape which are being excavated. This is from the genealogical software that I'm using, and this just shows some of the linked apical and focal ancestors in the Upper Kelapang. Now, the history of farming, we've taken soil layers in river meanders and peat bogs, which may indicate human activity quite early. We've got some very early dates, 4,300 to 4,500 BC. And there are some indications from the cores of possible origins of wet cultivation. It seems quite likely that there was a continuum between wet and dry cultivation in the past, that there wasn't this sharp distinction that we have now between large dry swidden fields and very well established bunded wet fields. And we don't know how long rice has been there. This is something that fascinates the archaeologists. It quite interests me as well. But we found a rice phytolith under charcoal dated at 4,500 approximately BC, but that may well be wild. We need more information on current pollen in order to identify the pollen in the cores. Now, sago stands and rice stones. There are these stones that are distributed around the highlands, which may perhaps be sago pounders, so Hugh Barton believes. And they are now used magically to increase rice, but they appear to be early tools. Oh gosh, I'm going to have to hurry up here. Okay, we've excavated 2 cemeteries so far, one of which was used until the 50s. Pangulu Miri, the last leader of the Kelabit, was buried there. He's from Padale. And they've yielded grave goods and charcoal, carbon dated to we don't know, it could be quite recent, could be quite a long time ago, but a lot of the grave goods are exactly the same as the ones that were said by informants to have been placed there until the 50s. Now, we've excavated a deer enclosure, a ta payo, okay. What do I say? We've excavated a tiger cave, which we've got a story about the origin of, which the story already existed, but we actually found this what appears to be a carving, and this was said by informants to confirm the story that they already knew. Rock shelters have been excavated with a carbon date of 810 to 530 BC under pottery, still in use by hunters. And this is a diagram showing what we found in general. And I was going to say something about the future, but I unfortunately don't think I've got time. The implications of what we might find for the future. You could ask about that if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Please.
Do the people there do a lot of hunting? What do they do for meat?
Yes, all of the everyday meat that they eat is from hunting. Yeah, and it's mostly wild pigs. So wild pigs are everyday meat. They also keep domestic pigs, which used to be domesticated wild pigs, but now they sometimes bring them from town, and they kill those for feasts. Those pigs are fed rice, which underlines the complementarity of wild meat and rice in domestic pigs.
Two totally different questions. One is factual and one is perhaps related to many of the discussions we've been having. The factual question, it looked, and I may be completely wrong, but the family meal, it looked as though people have converted to Christianity, probably. And what has been the impact on both the current belief systems and the memory of belief systems and the valuation of old belief systems? Has that affected the kind of information you can get and how people relate to it? The second is probably not for an answer, but just a discussion that seems to be going on. As we learn more about the cultured rainforests, the archaeology of the Amazon, we probably all ourselves feel that the rainforest is a construction. But what does this actually imply? I mean, you raised these questions and we weren't able to get to your answers, but the kind of big so what? So if the rainforests do have this long history of human occupation and use, is that just something we can say, neat, that's nice to know? Or does it actually have an impact on the way we think about the future and how others think about the use of the rainforest? So that's just a question that, it's a fairly obvious question, but we seem to be spending a lot of time kind of convincing ourselves that the rainforests are not the pristine rainforest. So what is the next step in our own thinking and how we talk to other people?
I'll just answer that, make a few comments on that first. I mean, I think we need to look at what people say forest is, rather than trying to derive some real meaning for it. What I said was that although the reality is that there is no pristine rainforest, in local minds there is this distinction, and that's what's so interesting, that they do construct something that might be the equivalent of what we call culture almost through rice growing, and they differentiate between that and any other form of management of the forest. So I think that's of interest, and I think we need to be looking for local practices of that kind rather than seeking the impossible definition of forest or rainforest or looking for pristine forest. As far as Christianity is concerned, yes, you're right. Yes, you're right. That was a prayer before a rice meal. And I thought it was a nice picture because of, well, the sanctity of the rice meal, the fact that they do pray before rice meals. Of course, we pray, Europeans pray before meals too, probably for a similar reason. And I think there's the carryover, that there is a sense of sanctity about a rice meal, which I'm sure is the same as before they became Christian. There's a silence, which is not the case when you eat snacks. When you eat snacks, you talk, you joke, you move around. When you eat a rice meal, you sit in a circle in silence. Now, Christianity has had a radical impact on the surface among the Kelabit. They've completely abandoned all their previous superstitions, following the movements of birds and various other signs, praying to the great spirit of the forest, him of the twisted heel, although he's still there in the forest. They don't think these spirits matter anymore. They've got a greater spirit to pray to, Jesus. But I don't know that Jesus is radically different from the other spirits, and interestingly, they pray to him. They often pray to him in the forest. They were constructing churches in the forest. Whilst I was there was a church just outside Padale on a hill that they kept going and praying to, although they were getting instructions from the main church centre to stop doing that. But the Nain Church Centre itself sponsors a yearly pilgrimage to a huge mountain, the highest mountain in Borneo, actually, which all of the Upper Duat people participate in. They go to the top of a mountain and pray every year. So I think there's a lot of continuity in many ways. It's not that they're thinking that the cosmos still works in the same way. It's just that they've discovered a new spirit. They wouldn't like me saying this, but they see Christianity as very much associated with modernity, with success. They became Christian because they saw that we are successful. We have access to the lalud, the power of the cosmos, of God, to a greater degree than they did, and therefore they wanted that too, and they have been successful. They have been successful. The head of the Malaysian airline system is a Kelabit. The director of immigration for Sarawak is a Kelabit. The resident of Miri division in charge of the whole Bairam is a Kelabit. There are Kelabit doctors and dentists, and this has happened in the past few decades. It's proof, isn't it? Christianity works.
Well, if there are no other questions, can I ask you, Monica, what about the future?
Okay, well, let me go on to my last slide. I didn't tell you much about the other things that are happening in the Highlands, the huge changes. Migration to town, more than half the Kelabit live in town. The loggers have arrived. There is a national park being gazetted in the northern part of the Highlands, which was meant to circle the whole Highlands. It was a cunning Kelabit plan on the part of the first educated Kelabit, who was in the forestry department, to protect the Highlands, originally concocted in the early 80s. But the bottom bit was removed, so unfortunately the loggers have got in. So there are huge changes going on up there. And the resident of the Miri division, the Kelabit, he's planning an agropolis up there. He's planning, in order to get the government to adopt the logging road, which goes up there, to open it to entrepreneurs from outside and give out concessions for people to plant cinnamon, rear halal cattle, etc. We're not sure what else at the moment. So all of these huge changes are likely to take place. In that context, I mean, our hope is sort of slightly submerged hope that the information we're gathering through this project will help people to show that actually they've been using the landscape for a long time. My only sorrow is that we're only going to be helping the Kelabit. I don't think the Penan are going to get a look in there.
Well, again, thank you very, very much.